I'm Barbara Ray with the URI Master Gardeners. Thank you all for tuning in this evening. So I'm going to let Mr. Schwartz, another URI Master Gardener, introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this important topic. My name is Warren Schwartz. The URI Master Gardener program welcomes Dr. Josef Görres. We have invasive jumping worms here in Rhode Island. Many of us have them here. If you want to see one, come on over to my house. They're quite the problem to be reckoned with, and we'll hear about that tonight. Dr. Görres, Josef Görres, is a professor of ecological soil management at UVM. He obtained his bachelor's in science and physics from University of Manchester and his PhD in paper physics from the University of Manchester Institute of Technology. He retooled as a soil scientist at the University of Rhode Island. His interests are in soil erosion, soil fertility and health, vermicomposting, and invasive earthworms. Currently, his lab is studying the ecology, spread, and control of invasive earthworms, as well as leveraging the mycorrhizae plant symbiosis to mitigate legacy phosphorus. Welcome, Dr. Görres. Hand it over to you.
Thank you, Warren, for the kind introduction. Okay, so I'm going to start right in because my voice may not hold the sound for long because I just found out I got COVID. So, and I'm starting to feel really evil. I mean, not evil as in like I will do something bad to you, but evil as in not well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about invasive earthworms, and you might say, hey, why is he not talking about jumping worms? The reason why I'm doing that is because before the jumping worms, there were other earthworms that came from other places, from across the ocean, and started to change ecosystems here. And so now we have this second wave of earthworms that are coming through, and those are the jumping worms. And there's 16 species of those in the US. You probably have 4 of them in Rhode Island, and in Vermont we have 3. So let me just get started a bit more. Hang on. It doesn't. Can I? Oh, there you go. Does anybody want to say anything about corporate extension at URI?
Yes, I'll just jump in quickly and say the URI Master Gardeners are part of the cooperative extension of the University of Rhode Island. Every state has a land grant college, excuse me, and ours is the University of Rhode Island. We have 5 specialties: land stewardship, food systems and agriculture, water resources, energy efficiency, conservation and renewables, and healthy lifestyles. If you choose to go to our website, you can click on each of those and find a lot of resources and information. Next, please. Next slide, please. So, and if those of you who are interested, you can become a Master Gardener. We have soil testing options, all available. You can get more information on our website. Next slide, please. You can email gardner@uri.edu. And we'll be taking applications for our core training class. Applications are due by November 1st, so you have some time to think about it. That's http://uri.edu/mastergardener. Next slide, please.
There's more coming at the end. There was
there will be some more slides at the end, and if I forget to tell you, there will be a brief survey that will be sent to you, and you will see it come up at the end of the talk, and it really helps us plan future programs if you take a minute to fill out the survey. So I will just turn it back now to you, Professor Görres.
Thank you. I just want to give Master Gardeners a quick plug. It's a wonderful program that exists across the nation, and even in Canada they have Master Gardener programs. It's super. As I said, I said that we have Master Gardeners in the neighborhood, and that it's just amazing what they do with their yards. And we kind of try and keep up with them. Impossible. So if you want a beautiful garden and work with other people as a volunteer, it's a great thing to do. Okay, so a quick list of facts about earthworms. So they are probably the greatest biomass in the soil, and for that reason, whatever they're feeding on is sort of translated into other parts of the food web, and so really great conduit of energy and matter from whatever is below ground into above ground components, and that could be plants, or it could actually also be some of the predators that will go after earthworms. 8,000 species, 200 species are cosmopolitan, so you find them pretty much on every continent, those 200. There's 24 species that in my neck of the woods are naturally occurring now in Vermont. And 2 of them might actually be of North American origin, that they originated in Vermont, but they might have made it up from south of the last glaciation by various means. So there's 19 exotic and invasive species here. Oh, there you go. Okay, I'm just going to get back. So if you look at the origin of earthworms, looking at the global distribution, you find that the global of these earthworms is basically patterned by the tectonic plates. So here in North America, we are on the Nearctic plate, and then Palearctic is in Europe, Eurasia, I should say, and then there's a few other ones that are important. But what I try to draw your attention to are these different colors. Look, if you look at the Nearctic world, there is blue taxa, so 9, 12, and 17, and you can read them up down here. What they are, the families. They are basically indigenous taxa that were preserved in the southern parts of North America, south of the last glaciation, and some of them have made it into the northern part of North America. Then we have these pale orange-looking indigenous and introduced taxa. So this is a difficult one where they don't quite understand which one they are. And then there is introduced taxa only. So these really red ones, those are basically earthworms that are definitely invasive and exotic here in North America. And this goes for pretty much all the tectonic plates. So one of the things that is really neat about earthworms is they occupy a totally interesting place in the food web. So ordinarily you think, if you have an organism that is changing a lot of things in the food web, then you probably have either a top predator or you have something feeding at the bottom of that food web. And earthworms are not like that at all. They will have a huge on the food web and a huge impact on the elemental cycles, but they come from the side of that food web. So if you look at this pyramid, you notice here's that earthworm. It affects everybody, either as food or as food or as a predator. So it's really cool. Ordinarily, you would place an earthworm right at the center of the food web because they're not top predators or bottom feeders, if you want to call it that. But in reality, every single layer is affected by these earthworms. So there was a paper like maybe 30 years ago, and somebody coined the term ecosystem worry. So worry as in feed on, and ecosystem as ecosystem. So these people were saying, hey, they're really actually feeding on ecosystems. They're not feeding on individual creatures. So, and the way that works is that earthworms will ingest basically two things: litter and mineral soil, right? So when they ingest mineral soil, they actually ingest aggregates, so clumped together soils at a very small scale. And each one of those little clumps has an ecosystem in it. So it's bacteria, fungi in there. There's some organic matter in there that the bacteria and fungi are working on. And then there's nematodes and protozoa and maybe springtails, so snow fleas in this aggregate. And they can feed on that. They tend to be small enough for earthworms to get to that. And so they're ingesting all sorts of different organisms. And that's really to understand, because that makes a huge difference to the way the soil ecosystem works when you have earthworms there. So the world is facing unprecedented planetary-wide issues. One is, of course, the loss of biodiversity, and the other one is global change. So global warming, if you want to use that term, and both of those interact with earthworms, right? So the earthworms might actually cause some of the extinctions at the smaller scale. And also when you walk around a forest that has earthworms in it, the forest will have a lot less biodiversity in the understory, so that's your, the mass extinction part of it, and then there's also this idea that that earthworms are feeding on organic matter, and they're putting carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere. And so that means they're also adding to climate change gases in the atmosphere. So that's a big deal, right? So both of those were discussed recently at COP15 in Montreal and at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And long discussions there about not the earthworms, but about the extinction and the greenhouse gases. So we are basically working in the northern forest, and it's an interesting forest because it stretches from Nova Scotia, right, over, all the way over to Wisconsin, and then maybe stretches down. This green here stretches down into Appalachia, and that ecosystem is at risk because of earthworms are invading. And this is not just the jumping worms; it's also the European earthworms. So that earthworms are not the only threat to northern hardwood forests. There's multiple stressors in concert to make life harder for the forests, right? So invasive species and pests. So there's earthworms, maybe the ash borer, emerald ash borer is another one. Climate change makes a difference. Development and fragmentation, and then there's many more other things that you could cite as being part of that multiple stressor problem. And by the way, here you see one of the culprits, one of the jumping worms. It's sitting on its castings, and you probably know that they probably look a little bit like coffee grounds to you. But they're small aggregates. They're pretty cool stuff. They are actually enriched in some of the nutrients, but there's other things that are going on that will make it difficult for things to grow in there. So, for example, because there's such a porous structure, so between the aggregates that you see here, between the castings, there's a lot of space there. So when it rains, water percolates through there, and the soil stays relatively dry, and that's causes drought problems. If we're going further north into the tundra grasslands, we're going to have more problems with climate change, right? So because the tundra grasslands have a ton of millions, I should say, of carbon locked up in that ecosystem, and if earthworms get there, then you can probably bet that carbon stock will be diminished really quickly and will go up into the atmosphere as CO2. This line here that I'm following right now is where the last glaciation was. And we're seeing some of these worms north of the last glaciation, which means they are invading these particular ecosystems. Really big deal. And just to make the point about earthworms reducing the amount of moisture in the soil, if you look at the figure here that's labeled B, that's basically the moisture content over a few years in a meadow, in the taiga ecosystem, and the red is the moisture content. The moisture content over here, right? So it goes up and down. So the red here is the moisture content for soils without earthworms. And then the black is where if you find earthworms, then that's what the traces would look like. And you notice that the moisture content is much lower than otherwise, right? So the earthworms actually dry out the soil quite a bit. So just to give you an idea, so 860,000 gigatons are sequestered as carbon sequestered in forests worldwide. And about 220 gigatons in the northern boreal forest in North America. So it's about a quarter of the forest carbon that's held here in northern US. And the worth of forest products and soils and services is about $150 trillion. So once you have these worms in there and they kind of mess around with that, the value probably goes down. I don't know how much it'll go down, but it'll go down. Then 30% of the land area has 80% of the land species in the forest. So the forests are really super important for both carbon and for the biodiversity in North America. Right. So we're looking at these earthworms. This is an image of what we are trying to do with jumping worms. We're looking at four things: spread of the earthworms, where they've arrived, where do they spread to, what is their impact on water quality, greenhouse gases, biodiversity, erosion, and we want to look at control. How can we control them? Biocontrol, pesticides, cultural measures like tillage, for example. And then we want to restore some of these ecosystems. And so we need to look at which native plants can survive the onslaught of the worms. And we want to kind of find some methods on how to deal with that. And at the bottom here, you see the behavior and climate and mode of transport basically identifies regions at risk where you have to kind of be careful because likely you're going to have some jumping worms travel there. Certification, registration, environmental management. So there are currently no nationwide certifications for vermicides. So they don't exist. And I can't really tell you, do this, get yourself this stuff, because I'm not a certified pesticide applicator. I will change that at the end of the month. I'm supposed to take an exam and become one of those. And then finally, what are we going to do in the horticultural trade? How can we use horticulture as a way of how can we work with horticulture to find ways of ecological restoration in the forests that are now affected by earthworms? So the big thing that you really want to know is how can you identify jumping worms? And so here's that picture that we saw earlier. This is definitely enlarged, and you see a brownish reddish worm that looks a bit like a snake as it lies there. So another name for them is snake worms. They do work, they move like snakes as well. But then there's this band, right? So this band is called a clitellum, and in jumping worms, all the way around the worm. There's no break. It goes all the way around the worm. And it's really clearly offset from the rest of the body by color. So that is your first indication that this is a jumping worm. Another one is that it might be sitting on these castings. These castings are typical for jumping jumping worms. Excuse me. So what is their phenology? When do it come out? So as I mentioned earlier when we are talking about jumping worms, just generally before the talk started, that we already have quite a few jumping worms in Rhode Island that have hatched, and also in Vermont. We have quite a few of them that we saw on Tuesday. So once temperatures go above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you can expect that some of these jumping worms will hatch. They may not stick around forever because tomorrow be like a -5 degree day, and then whatever is too close to the surface will die. But so you notice, so the phenology is shown here on the left-hand side of the panel, and you notice that in the beginning, right around now, earthworms are hatching, and they seem to be hatching differently every year. So there's one year here that at 300, and I have to look at it, 330 juveniles on average. So there was actually some plots that had 600 juveniles per square meter. That's a lot, right? So that's like 80 per 80 per square foot. But it doesn't last very long. So eventually there's a crash in the abundance of the worms right here, looking at the red one. But it's true for the other ones as well. It's just that this crash might occur at slightly different times during the season. The reason why there's differences is because of moisture in the soil. They like moisture, and because of the temperature that they're exposed to during that phase of the year, right? So the ones that are down here, this orange trace, which doesn't really go very far, had maybe a peak of 150. That was a year when the soil was dry, and so they don't do dry well as worms. They do well as cocoons, but not as worms. So we don't see very many worms that way. Anyway, so around about beginning of July, all the way into beginning of August, you might see the very first adult. That adults have that clitellum that goes all the way around their body. This is a range of adult sizes, so pretty large, going into smaller, and this might be somewhat correlated to 3 species. So Amynthus tokiensis is the smallest one of them. Amynthus agrestis is the next larger one, and the Metaphia hilgendorfi is actually pretty big. So here's Metaphia hilgendorfi on the left-hand side of the slide. And I wish I could show you this a bit more, but there are 2 dots right there. That identifies this as an Metaphia hilgendorfi. On the ventral side, on the bottom side, just ahead of the clitellum, but 4 segments ahead of the clitellum, there's 2 genital markings, they're little circles. And they are, so that's how I know this worm. And then there's Amynthus agrestis, which is the next smaller one. So up to between 70 and 120 millimeters in size, so 2.8 to 6.3 inches. And then A. tokiensis, the smallest one here in New England. So only 1.1 inch to 4.9 inches. And these numbers are for adults. They're not for juveniles. So 1.1 inch, that's really small. If you go to Japan, the Amynthus tokiensis is actually of the same size as the Amynthus agrestis. It's not smaller at all. It's just the same size. So first time we went out there, we're looking for worms, and I immediately picked out, the Amynthus agrestis and said, "This is Amynthus agrestis. It's this big, And they said, "No, it's Amynthus tokiensis," because if you look at it carefully, it's got these characters that identify it as Amynthus tokiensis. So they're about the same size there, which is pretty interesting. So one of the things that happens all the time is that the worms are misidentified, or that other worms are being misidentified by lay people. and that's fine. Right now, we're looking at juveniles, and just to show you where there's a juvenile right here. So on that leaf that's on the right-hand side of the slide, this is a juvenile. It's tiny. It's tiny. But you'd be surprised. So I took a student, an undergraduate student, out with me to have her learn to count these worms in the wild. And as soon as she'd seen one, she suddenly found a lot of them. So you get an eye for it really quickly. And then the way we tested whether or not these small worms were actually jumping worms. We did this. So we touched it, and then we touched it some more. Then it eventually did that. It kind of thrashing about, and that is also another way of identifying these worms. They thrash about a lot and very vigorously. There are some worms that do the same thing, but they're really slow doing it. These guys, they just go really fast at this. So here are a couple of worms that you might miss. So here's a worm that I don't know which worm this is, but it has a clitellum that is kind of raised. You can maybe see that a little bit. It's raised, and when you look at the underside, it's not going all the way around. So that's not a jumping worm. Here's the jumping worm. It has a clitellum that is pretty flush with the rest of the body, and it's got this color offset. So it can be white, anywhere from white to pink. It depends. And that can happen in the same species. And then, of course, there is the red wiggler, which can also thrash about. And so people kind of get that wrong frequently, say, I've got these bad worms. And when they actually don't have the jumping worms, they have red wigglers. And the way to identify them is by a couple of ways. So one way would be to look at their tail, and the tail has sort of a yellow end. I don't know whether you can see that there, but it's got a yellow end. And so sometimes they're known as yellowtail. So not just red wigglers, but yellowtail. And then they're also known as tiger worms because when they're stretched, they have these lighter bands between the segments. So if you see a yellow tail like here, or segments that are distinguished by lighter colored stripes, then you're dealing with red wigglers and not with jumping worms. And the reason why I show this is because they can jump around as well, but they're very different looking. So when we are looking at when we're trying to evaluate the invasion, we are basically looking at different ways of different barriers to invasion, right? So the very first barrier is a geographic barrier. How do I get from Japan to the US or from Japan to Europe? So it's a long haul. So it requires them to either be able to move with water or to be on the wings of humans. And for the jumping worms, it's definitely the wings of humans. So we are moving them around with trade. And then they get introduced into maybe horticultural ecosystem, and there they kind of stay until conditions in the wide world are becoming better, right? So horticultural ecosystems are great for these worms. You irrigate, so they like water. You put mulch down, they like mulch, they like organic material. The mulch keeps things warm, they like warm. So in a horticultural ecosystem, they have an easy time. It's when they want to get out into the forests, it might be because now you're dealing with really climatic differences, and they have to establish in the wild. They have to then reproduce in the wild, and then eventually they might end up being surviving in forests or meadows in the wild. But I think one of the things that has happened, they probably could escape the horticultural systems because it was getting warmer. So it was getting warmer. The growing season was becoming longer, and so they had a chance to move. So introductions and spread, right? So the first wave of species that came to the U.S. was with European species that came with the of the ship. So the ships are loaded up with soil, and on the European side they came over this way, and then they took the soil out and they loaded all the gold, silver, and whatever else they were doing, timber, to take that back into the UK or the continental Europe. And now, wherever they've been introduced, they're now moving elsewhere with horticulture, so pots that might be invaded. Maybe through the European worms are also good bait worms, so you can buy bait and take it to a stream to fish. And then there's, of course, vermicomposting, where you might actually move some of the vermicomposting worms from one place to another. Laurie, are you asking a question? Laurie Gates? Okay. So cocoons are really survivals. So the earthworms exist in two types of phases. One is the actual vermiform, and the other one are the cocoons. And the cocoons are really good survival structures. They allow a population of jumping worms to survive drought, summer drought, and winter temperatures. And that's really important. So they can actually survive several years without there being hatching. And these are the typical things where you might find them in pots, or you might find them in compost. Frequently, you go to a composting facility and they basically say, we don't have any earthworms, and you look and there's no earthworms. But when they sell their compost to an intermediary, then that intermediary holding might actually have earthworms on site, and these composts are being invaded, and then from there they go to the gardens. These are the earthworms of Vermont, and we have 4 jumping worms. These are all jumping worms. We have one. Actually, we have 2 earthworms that are now regarded as North American worms. Dendrodrilus rubilus is one of them, and then Dendrobina octator is another one. And the reason why they are regarded as North American worms is because somebody ran sequences, all sorts of worms, and these worms are closer to a genus called Bimastus, which is a North American worm, than they are to Dendrodrilus genus, which is a European worm, which is kind of cool. Here's Pennsylvania, and so that's one. I'm showing you one native worm here. But you go to Pennsylvania, which is much more southern. Maybe half of the landmass has not been glaciated. You'll find a whole bunch of really interesting native North American earthworms. So all these Diplocardias here, the Bimastus, the Sparganophilus. There's a few others that I don't even want to pronounce. But so if you go further south, you will find more of the worms that are not invasive. But at the same time, you have there's 10 North American worms and 30 species out of 30 species, so there's 20 that are invasive. So the second wave, which is jumping worms, there's different names for them. You can read them there, and they may have come with horticulture. And one of the stories, the origin stories, is that they came with the cherry blossoms. That's a theory. Nobody has actually shown that. But there's another invasion that happened with jumping worms in Pennsylvania, where they can actually tie the worms to a gift of horticultural goods from Japan. So it's not even though there's no real proof that the cherry blossoms are doing this, there is definitely there's definitely other areas where the proof is there. Where in the Northeast do you find them? So here's Wisconsin. You've got some points here. You got lots of Minnesota. You got a lot of things in Wisconsin and Illinois, and all the way up into Maine, and now into. Okay, so I have to move this image again. it got rearranged when I put this on the University of Rhode Island slides. But so there's sightings in Nova Scotia, there's sightings in New Brunswick, there's sightings in and around Montreal, and then there's sightings up here in Ontario. And there's more and more being sighted. So until about 2 years ago, or actually 1 year ago, there was only one sighting from Canada. So now there's a whole lot of them. So people have been able to identify these worms more easily, and I'm sure that for longer than just last year. And so now there's more and more sightings coming forward. So what's the impact? Well, it all starts with soil modification. There's 3 soils here. On the left-hand side, the soil here is a really cool soil. It has a duff layer, so an undisturbed organic horizon, which is the place of the seed bank and the germination medium. And then you go to the soil that's invaded by jumping worms, and you see all these castings. And these castings are really not super good for plants to get established in. And then finally, there's European earthworms that create really dense layers that are also, again, not the best place for seed bank and germination. So there's a big difference between the original soil and the soils that have been modified. That gives rise to all these cascades that people talk about. Like, so here's that earthworm. It changes the soil structure, and that changes, how much ragweed there is, and how many ticks there are, buckthorn, blah blah blah, and then that has an effect on the next level of the cascade, and then the next one, and eventually it ends up in human health, in the economy, and in the environment. So there's huge impacts of these worms, and the group that I'm working with is trying to classify and measure those impacts. Effect on vegetation, so multiple stressors, moisture, earthworms, and deer. On the right-hand side, there's a place with Invasive agrestis, so one of those jumping worms, and on the right-hand side, that is. On the left-hand side, there's an undisturbed sugar bush at Camel Sump. There's no earthworms there. And these guys come in after the earthworms have done something here, and they start feeding on what is left. So there's a huge grazing pressure on the understory, and that leads to less saplings making it. So there's jumping worms, the number of saplings per square meter, it's tiny. It's like a half a sapling on average. This is from 49 sites across New England, where there is night crawlers, is the middle one here. For the night crawlers, you have a little bit more. And then for where there's no earthworms, you have a really high number there, twice that of the Lumbricus terrestris, or the night crawler. What are the impacts that are observed in horticulture? So the first really worrying account of these worms was from Pennsylvania, where there was the Tiffany's who had a plantation of hostas, and they were noticing that one year the hostas were smaller, they might have been dying, and they dug around the soil, and they found that there was this really huge number of worms, and they behaved like jumping worms. They didn't know anything about jumping worms in those days, and they had that verified by a a scientist from Wisconsin Minnesota, who flew out and had a look at it. So that's the very first time that somebody said, hey, these things are a problem. The Maine Department of Agriculture says in nurseries and greenhouses, Invasive earthworms reduce the functionality of soils and planting media and cause severe drought symptoms, simply because, excuse me, simply because the castings of the earthworms are such that roots can't establish themselves very easily, and they can't extract moisture out of there. So that's one reason that this happens. Then Cornell is saying jumping worms can severely damage roots of plants in nurseries, gardens, forests, and turf. They, along with other invasive species, can also help spread invasive plant species by disturbing the soil. So that is another hypothesis that people have tested, and it has been borne out that this is true. So in the wrong direction. Okay, so we said, hey, why don't we test this whole thing about the castings being at the root of all evil for horticulture, right? So we had 3 treatments. One treatment, so we bought some small plugs, cilantro plugs, and we put them into ProGrow potting mix without Amynthus being there, without the jumping worms being there. And we didn't put any jumping worms in afterwards either. And then we had another one where we put the jumping worms in 2 weeks before we transplanted the cilantro, and we ended up with this. This is about the same time as these worms, as these plants, right? So there's a lot less growing, and sometimes there's nothing growing. And then finally, we had one where we put the cilantro plugs in at the same time as the Amynthus, and the jumping worms. There was different results. So in some cases, there was a huge result. The plants die, and in other cases, the plants were thriving. So we think that these castings are a problem. How do you control them? If you become should you join as a master gardener? You might be on the hotline, and so somebody calls and says, I have these worms. What can we do? There are super strong emotions that go with this. Anger, sadness. There's a whole bunch of emotions, and really, really strong emotions when people find out that they have these worms. So if you haven't got the worms yet, then you will try to keep them out. So propagate from seed and from cuttings, or exchange bare root, so you can be sure that there's no worms in the pot, and hopefully no cocoons either. So can they be controlled? Yeah, maybe. I'm going the wrong direction. I'm sorry. So here's the bare root thing. So you will learn about this if you become a master gardener. How do you do this? Where do you cut the plant? How do you put the stick in the mud? And then you also will probably learn something about bare root planting. Those are kind of more, if you want to keep these worms out, those might be ways of avoiding them. You could also try and, sorry, I have to gather my thoughts. You also want to learn how to solarize compost and any other kind of soil material that you may want to bring into your place. It's a bit of work, but if you do it right, then like you have the compost enveloped in a plastic drop cloth, like you see here, and then you put that in the sun for 2 days. You get really high temperatures. So both the worms and the cocoons die at about 40 degrees Celsius. So that's about 104, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And you get these packages up to really high temperatures. If you got them already, then, don't let anybody tell you that you're a bad person, for sure. But you have to do something about that. So there's different things you could do. None of them are really tried out, but we're trying some of these out this summer. So one is cultural practices. So try and do some tillage, disrupt their habitat. You have to put the tillage in mid-May when there's a lot of earthworms, but definitely not earlier than that, because then you're just moving cocoons about, and not too late, like mid-October or something like that. Most of the cocoons have already been produced, and the cocoons are probably not bothered by the tillage. So biocontrol, we've tried entomopathogenic fungi, Bovaria bassiana and Metarhizium anisopli. So these are specialized fungi that are able to control insects, but they seem also to be able to control the jumping worms. The problem is that you have to process. Let's say we have Botanigard, which is Bovaria bassiana. This is the name of the product. Let's say you have that. If you just apply that to the soil without of making it stick, nothing happens. The worms are really not going to be unhappy. But if you use something like cocoa wet or some other sticky type materials, so Botanigard not Botanigard, but cocoa wet allows things to stick to surfaces. And so if you have Botanigard mixed up with cocoa wet and you apply that to the worms, have a better chance of being controlled, because the fungus sticks to the epidermis. This is my postdoc, and she is working hard there, controlling earthworms in what is that? Geranium. What she did, she took the Bovaria bassiana and she grew that Bovaria on millet grains. The millet grains are a bit like these worms like millet. They go for that millet, right? So it's bait. And it also allows this fungus to stay alive longer, so you get at the worms more easily. So this is for juveniles. So they're about maybe 4 inches long, but they didn't have a clitellum. So if you look at the first, so when we say mycotized, we mean this kind of millet where you grew the fungus on the grain. So for 15 grams, you have so for 15 grams, you have 80%, almost 80% mortality for. Here's another mycotized one, and then if you use straight Bovaria bassiana, it's no longer what you take out of the bag, but you cultured the Bovaria bassiana and you sprayed that on the worms. You once again have about 70% mortality. Then the latest development is that Bovaria bassiana with plus cocoa wet. So if we do Bovaria bassiana plus the cocoa wet, we get a 73% mortality. For just cocoa wet, only 43%. So combining some pesticides with the adjuvants might help. And then there's of course the tea tree extract that I can't remember who mentioned it. So there's a company now that is applying for certification as a vermicide, and that's out of Minnesota. So eventually you will have a certified tea tree extract, but it's not there yet. I can't tell you. I'm not allowed to tell you this is what you have to use, because I'm not a certified pesticide applicator. Then other interventions. So Mariam was trying out different kinds of soil-borne creatures, microorganisms, and they had really high, after 144 days, 4 hours, that had really high, that's 7 days, somewhere out there, 6 or 7 days, they had really high mortality. Penicillium, Staphylococcus, and Bacillus. And the reason why we're not pursuing this is because there might be some human health concerns with those. There's also, of course, maybe you've seen some of those hammerhead worms. They're also exotic. We see more and more of those. They go after earthworms, and then of course there are ants that also don't like earthworms on their patch. So biocontrol summary: there are currently no biopesticides that are certified, so we can't really do anything. But Bovera bassiana and Metarhizium brunnium are really good in the future. Maybe really good control agents. And we have figured out how to mycotize millet in common kitchen equipment. And there's a little bit of a backstory here in that the Department of Agriculture has sort of said you can actually use this because the Bovera bassiana is a pesticide that's been certified for other things, and you can extend that pesticide certification to other pests if you follow the label. So here in Vermont, we're sort of in a gray area where we may or may not be able to use this. This chemical, thingsosaponin is one way, and then so we're making a comparison here. We're growing nasturtium, and we put earthworms in there, and we try to kill the earthworms with Bovera bassiana, this plant and millet, and maybe just plants. And then we have different soap concentrations and different vinegar concentrations. And the really interesting thing is that the soap is doing pretty well compared to the mortality of the mycotized millet, but it's also reducing the quality of the plants that you're growing. So there's a lot of necrosis on the leaves, and they're just growing a lot slower when you have soap added. But it does kill the worms relatively well. So these are adult worms. So it's more difficult to kill them than the ones that we had in the other bioassays. And then vinegar is super. It kills these worms and it kills the plants. So that's really not what you want, I hope. So chemical controls, there's nothing currently certified. There is one company that is going for certification of tea tree seed. You can buy tea tree seed. This is not the company, by the way, this one here, but it's not certified yet, and this particular one is not certified at all. So you have to think, should I really do that? Because it's illegal to use. Even if you think, oh, I'm going to use this I can use this as a vermicide, and you apply it, then that's almost illegal. So the thing that makes this research really slow is that there's a lack of funding from large agencies. So, for example, the USDA or the NSF are really not interested in this kind of work. And we are now putting together a group of people that will fundraise to control these earthworms. The other thing is these worms only have one life cycle per year. So you can't easily repeat an experiment. So you have to wait another year to repeat the same experiment. And at that point, maybe the earthworms are doing different things. So it's very difficult. Okay, so back to the University of Rhode Island Cooperative Extension.
Thank you, Professor Görres. We'll let you rest your voice for a minute. That was a wonderful talk. We really enjoyed it. Here's just a few more slides before we get to the question. So we do have a cooperative extension YouTube channel, and this recording of this program will be out there in about a week. But you can also look and see some of our other programs from the past. You can, if you enjoyed this program, you can sign up for additional events under the Cooperative Extension events page. Next slide, please. We also have tickencounter.org run by professors who have been studying ticks for their whole career, and you can take a picture and send it to tickencounter.org, and they'll tell you what kind of a tick it is, and depending on the size and shape of the tick, they'll be able to suggest whether you need to take further action. Next slide, please.
It should be there.
We also have programs to help homeowners learn about their septic systems. We have an on-site wastewater training center, and you can sign up for programs. And we also have information about stormwater systems. Next, please. And so if you have questions, again, we welcome you to email your questions or call the hotline at the number on the screen, 401-874-4836, or send an email to gardner@uri.edu. We are also having free soil testing for pH and structural composition at various events around the state. So again, you can check our website and find those locations. And from March, October, there's a drop-off at the University of Rhode Island at the Malin Outreach Center. You can pursue that if you're interested. Next slide, please. And so again, you can sign up for emails to learn more information. And we're also out there on social media at urimastergardeners.com. I think that's the last slide now. So Warren, if you could present some questions to Professor Görres.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Görres. I first want to point out the Facebook group that someone mentioned called Invasive Jumping Worms Observation and Discussion Group. It's indeed a good source of information, science-based information. It's also a good sort of group therapy sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
But a lot of the questions, Dr. Görres, are about biological controls and the Beauveria bassiana and the tea seed meal. When can we might expect those to be labeled? When can we expect to have a fairly easy solution to this problem?
I do not know. I think at the earliest, probably midsummer, at the latest next year, if at all, right? So, I mean, the EPA might come out and say, oh, this is causing problems. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen because there's have other saponins that have been certified for as a pesticide. It's not for necessarily for earthworms, but for other things. And so there is data on why you may or may not want to have them certified. So it's really up. So what they have shown is that there's plenty of information about saponins, which is what's in a tea tree. That's tea tree seed. There's a lot of information about that in terms of environmental impact, and there's now also some really interesting research done on the efficiency of these saponins, right? So the two necessary are there. It's just a question of how the EPA looks at it. So stay tuned.
Okay. Related question, what is the impact of the pesticide application on other beneficial organisms, including pollinators?
Yeah, big question, right? So pollinators are huge. And I mentioned earlier that, we're trying to do something about the COVID is getting to me about biodiversity, right? So I think that both the Beauveria bassiana, which is an insect-killing fungus, and also the tea tree seed oil can have effects on other things, right? So you have to basically, but the Beauveria bassiana is already certified for insects, and so you have to follow the instructions on the label, and they tell you where to apply and when to apply, so that you minimize the amount of damage done to the pollinators. And I think in the end, that has to happen with the tea tree seed meal as well.
Okay. How are these worms controlled in Asia, in their native places? Is it a natural check, and can we learn anything from that in controlling them here?
We only have a couple of hypotheses about that. We haven't tested that yet. Well, the first thing that happens is if you go to Japan and you look for these earthworms in the woods, you don't find them. What you have to do is you have to go to the ditches of the roadsides where they accumulate when there's a big rainfall, overland flow, they'll wash them into the ditches. So, and even then you don't find very many of them. Like here where you get 300 per square meter, but it's much lower than that. So we don't know what, there might be predators, sure, but it may also just be the chemistry of the litter. So the plant litter that they are encountering, right? So the sugar maple has a really good C to N ratio. It breaks down really easily, but the evergreens in so evergreen oaks in Japan may not be that way, or even the big stands of bamboo are not, they may not be of the same kind of elemental chemistry as our sugar maple. So those are the two things that might be true.
Is incorporating diatomaceous earth or peat moss into the soil an effective control mechanism?
Yeah, so the diatomaceous earth doesn't work, and the peat moss. When you go to Japan and you work with the Japanese vermologist, for lack of a better word, they actually have the containers that are full of peat moss, and they're putting the worms in that container. It holds water, it keeps them happy. So I don't think peat moss is going to be a good solution.
Do the worms harm the roots directly, or is that a secondary effect of the soil disruption?
So there are some people that say that the earthworms can damage the roots, and there's some research done in Europe about that. So it's not our jumping worms, but it's the European worms that were implicated. Yeah, so generally we don't think of roots being gnawed upon by the earthworms, but it's possible, right? So if anybody has the time and the patience, I'd love to sit you in front of with earthworms crawling all around it and see what they eat. We have lots of discussions like that. How do we find out what they actually eat? And there are some clever ways that this is done. So there are some ways that you can label with isotopes the plant and find out where the labeled plant material goes. So there's an indirect way of guessing what's happening to the plants.
There were a few questions about solarization that you covered some of that, solarizing the compost. How deep can it be, or how deep should the soil
6 to 8 inches in a package, right? So you have a ground cloth, you have enough on the ends of the ground cloth so that you can kind of bring the ends up, and then you put another cloth over the top. and the thickness of this could be 6 to 8 inches. You have to tuck in the ground cloth, so the ground cloth and the top cloth underneath the pile of compost, so that the worms can't escape. That's one. And you need at least 2 days of really hot weather, really hot. So I'd say mid-May you can start doing this, all the way up to maybe mid-September. But as you go towards the shoulder season, you have to maybe have it out longer, and you have to make sure that you put it out when there is sunshine, right? So look at the Weather Channel or the Wonderground or whatever they're called, to see what the long range, so 4 or 5 days are in terms of sun. There you go.
So since these worms live in the top region of the soil, would it be effective if you have, say, a 12-inch raised bed to solarize that bed in that heat?
No, they really like to escape downwards when. So I just tell you one story that I have experienced myself. So I did some bokashi, and you have to bury the bokashi at about 30 centimeters, a foot deep. And so I did that, and then I grew potatoes on top of that. And then when I dug at the potatoes, there was a ton of these earthworms in that layer 1 foot down. So they can move, especially in gardens where the soil is relatively loose.
Couple of questions about concerns about logging equipment moving through people's areas, and concern
Sure.
about the cocoons being moved.
Yeah, so like with any other invasive species, clean your machinery before you move to the next place. That is, of course, not necessarily what everybody does, right? So some people say, who cares? It's earthworms, right? F that. And so they're acting irresponsibly if that happens. But a lot of people that are loggers, they know about that. They basically clean their machines on site, and then they move on.
Okay. Maybe one more question, if that's okay.
Yes, that's okay.
Okay. There was a lot of discussion about how people ended up receiving these worms, and some people from bagged compost. I know I got mine from, I'm fairly certain I got mine from wood chips from the municipal transfer station.
For sure.
You had mentioned nursery pots, common sources. Would you say there is a most common source for these worms?
I think nursery pots are probably the most common, but I would not dismiss the idea that earth materials can move these worms, right? So that I think that happens. So here in Vermont, there's different kinds of composting companies, and each one of them has, in some ways, being implicated to move these things around. But if you go on their site, on site and you look for the earthworms, they're not there. Where this might happen is when they find an intermediary who sells the compost that they have stored from where it was produced. So you have that middleman that might have these worms on their premises, and the worms are invading the compost pile because it's juicy carbon, juicy organic matter.
Okay.
So look around for signs of these worms, for sure. I mean, here there's also people that have said that they found them in bags, right? So bagged compost, and they said, well, we try to solarize that, and the worms are just I'm so sorry, my brain is fried. They put the bags on the ground in the sun, and they find out that the worms actually going down to the bottom because they're just at where the soil is sort of in touch with a cooler area, and the soil surface. And so maybe you have 60 degrees Celsius at the top, but at the bottom of that 8 inches, you may have only 30 degrees. And then the sun flipped it over, and the worms again went down into the bottom part of that pile. So they said that you could get around that if you put the soil on the pallet, so it's not directly on the soil surface.
Well, I think with that, we'll thank you very much, Professor Görres, for hanging in there. And we officially want to thank you and send you home to bed and wish you a speedy recovery. We thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, my pleasure. It's always nice to give a talk for the University of Rhode Island, one of my alma maters, right? So it's always good.
Well, thank you so much. And everyone, if you would complete the survey, we'd appreciate it very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to end the meeting now.
If you could share that with me, that'd be great.
Yes, okay, I will. In about a week.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.